Well, now in a good way, let us start our works. Let me say in name of our institute, the Institute of Public Law and Political Science of the Faculty of Law of the University of Lisbon, that you are all welcome to this session about the right of water. And let me thank the colleagues who accept to be here for this session this morning. I had to thank Mrs. Catarina de Albuquerque. It's a pleasure to have you here. We hope to have it more often, that you come here more often and participate in our programs. Let me say you that now we are very active in the field of environmental law, and we would like to have cooperation with you personally and institutionally with the organization that you represent, and it's a pleasure and an honor having you here. Professor Lawrence Meyer from the University of Augsburg is here in an Erasmus exchange program. Since you know it's a thing that I like very much, since I'm for 20 years or so the Erasmus coordinator. I was one of the first Erasmus coordinators in Portugal. It's one of the things I'm very keen on. It's a pleasure having you here. And Augsburg is also one of my favorite towns since 30 years ago. I'm old enough to say that, Mrs. Albuquerque not, but I am. I've been there for 2 years preparing my PhD with my wife, and they were great times. The city is wonderful, Renaissance-style city, and the university is very good. It tells me that it has been changed a few years ago, so I must have to go back in order to refresh my memories. But it's a pleasure having you here, and we also want to have a more intensive cooperation with the University of Augsburg. And last but not least, Professor Vasilika Samchin, you are hearing us from the internet, and you appear in a few moments. That's the good thing about this new media and the internet that can make us all together at the same time. And it's a pleasure having you here. You have been last year. You have a wonderful book on the law of water that you offered to me. You are a specialist in these matters. It's a pleasure to have you here and an honor to the faculty. And hope you come again too in a few time. So, after that, and excuse me because I did not, I have here some small notes I have to use. Well, I was told to make not just the presentation of the people, about the presentation of people. I have to thank, in the name of the Institute, to Professor João Miranda, that will arrive in the afternoon, to Professor Rui Guerra da Fonseca and Dr. Mark Kirkby for this wonderful organization. It's very good that you organize all this, and we are very thankful to you in the name of the Institute and in the name of the law faculty. Thank you very much. So, I was asked to say some words about the right to water. As you know, my cup of tea is not international law, but is constitutional and administrative law, and this is a theme I've studied, and I'm going to place it in a kind of theoretical way, so it can be a good complement to the other interventions we are going to hear afterwards. The right of water, it's a new right emerging from the right to the environment. And it's a very recent from the theoretical point of view. The right to the environment is also something that is very young. It came in the 60s, the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, when the questions of environment became crucial questions for the society and for the policy. And after that turning point, there was a need of public policies, a need of law in order to preserve the environment. And I used to say to my students that like Benjamin Constant talked about the liberty of the old and the liberty of the moderns, if you look at ecology, we can say that before the 60s of last century, we lived in the ecology of the olds, because ecology was a problem for the people and for small groups, but it was not a political problem. But after the 60s, the question of ecology became a crucial question for the society, and this turning point made that this ecological question became so important for our constitutional field that we can compare it with the social question in the end of the 90s. So he had, in the end of the 19th century, the social question that made the need for a reconstruction of the state and for the institutions. And we have now, in the 60s of the 20th century, the ecological question that also demanding new answers from the state and from public policy. So the questions of a right to environment, as the questions of a right to water, arise first in the international law field. And the documents in the end of the 60s begin to speak of a right to the environment. And then they become a constitutional issue, because most of our constitutions, like the Portuguese constitution, included in their Bill of Rights the right to the environment. Some others did not. It's the case of our German situation that our German colleague can explain afterwards. But nevertheless, in Germany, the Constitutional Court considered that the right to the environment is a fundamental right. So it's not written in the Constitution, it's previewed in the Constitution in a more objective way, but is recognized as a constitutional right by the Constitutional Court, and it has the same status. But there is another thing that is interesting for me as a law professor, and that's a consequence of something that we can call the global constitutionalism. Because before the 60s and the 70s, the questions of international law and constitutional law were really separate. We used to say that constitutional law is applied for the citizens of one state, and international law is applied for the states. And the state is responsible to the fulfillment of the obligations he assumes in the international field, and is responsible towards the other states and to the international society. And the thing that changed in the 70s and began this movement of a global constitutionalism was that after that we thought that human rights are immediately applicable, and a citizen can process his own state when there is a violation of human rights. So this idea of direct application of human rights treaties in national order gives a new possibility to the citizens to contest the decisions of his own government. So the question became like a constitutional one. It's the same thing to plea for a constitutional right in a constitutional court or in a normal court, or it's the same thing theoretically, or to do that for a human right when we say there is a direct application of human rights. But there is another thing that changed at the same time. This is a real change in the actors of international law, because the actors are no longer the states alone, but we say that the citizens the individuals are also actors of international law. But at the same time, another thing happened. It was the courts, and something that look like courts. Sometimes they are administrative entities that have the right to judge questions that come from an international source, but to treat them like a national situation. And that is normal when we think about constitutional law, but that happened also and became very frequent in administrative law. There is a paper I like very much from Sabino Cassese, one of the authors that talk about this global constitutionalism. It's named Turtles and Shrimps. My students know it very well, where he says that an international situation that had to deal with two big countries, at least. There was Japan on one side, the United States on another. There was a problem with the importation of shrimps to the United States that the United States decided to prohibit with the argument that Japan was not interested in taking care of turtles. And this situation that placed in an international field had no solution whatsoever was solved by a public entity that had to apply the treaties, and that entity ruled the problem like an administrative one. So it was the first case of global administrative law. And the court said that the USA, the United States of America, did not take care of the procedure, and there was a violation of the procedure since the people interested in the case were not heard. So he said the principle of the due process of law has been violated. And at the same time, they told that the decision was arbitrary and capricious because the shrimps had nothing to do with the turtles. And the way to protect turtles was not to prohibit the commercialization of shrimps coming from another country. So the decision was arbitrary and capricious. And the United States took out the decision and applied it. So there was really a change. There was the beginning of a global administrative law, which is, you know, is one thing that I'm very keen on and I like very much and try to study it in Portugal. And that was a kind of a revolution in the global order and a kind of revolution in for our theoretical way of seeing the right. But, seeing the law more generally. But if that revolution had appeared, and now it's effective in the field of administrative law, in the field of constitutional law, that idea of a global constitutionalism is placed just in the field of human rights. So it's very important to consider the right to the environment as an individual right, to consider the right to the water as an individual right, since that gives an opportunity to make it pliable to all the situations in the countries, in every country whatsoever, because of this idea of a global constitutionalism. And I would like to say that I'm not like Cassese, completely in favor of the idea of having a global constitution. I believe that unfortunately we did not yet arise that situation. But on the other hand, I must say also that if there is a global constitution, there is a global constitutionalism in the field of human rights. That's the importance of, that's why the importance of considering the right to water and the right to environment as real human rights and real fundamental rights. And I would like to say also that from the theoretical point of view, in my mind, there is no longer difference between human rights and a fundamental right, since they are all rights that are mandatory and must be applied for all the public authorities, and since the citizen is able to go to a court or to something similar in order to protect his human rights, the distinction between human rights and fundamental rights disappears. That's one of my theses, of course, debatable, like all ones, but I think that's one of the consequences of our constitutionalism global nowadays. So this is something that I like it very much, and this is something that is very important when we talk about these rights, the right of environment and the right of water. Now, when we talk about that, the other thing we need to know from a theoretical point of view, it is if we are really in a fundamental right. We are really dealing with a fundamental right when we say about it, when we talk about it. And we need to have a notion of the right to water and the right of environmental law, how they, if they are connected or not, if they are independent or they are the same right. I used to say, from the law point of view, there is no need to have lots of rights dealing with the same matter. And when we have this kind of association, we should make a theoretical understanding in order to comprehend the things in this broader situation. And I believe that's something that we have to do in the field of constitutional law. When we talk about a fundamental right, this fundamental right is not indeed something shaped only in one way. It's a mix of different rights and a mix of different duties, a mix of different principles, and all together come to a broader concept of fundamental rights. And that's also a new approach from constitutional law. In the beginning, I was talking of a new approach from international law. Now, it's a new approach I'm talking about from the field of constitutional law. The rights are not things that can be correspondent to easy structures. The rights are more and more complicated, and this idea, this complication of human rights and fundamental rights make that they are composite, they have lots of components, so it's easy to talk about fundamental rights that includes many rights on itself. Because we have to talk about an idea that is that was very well developed by our German colleagues, and one of them that was my friend, and is still my friend, the Professor Hartmut Bauer, that is now in Dresden, and I met in Augsburg when we were both preparing our PhD, so I knew him doing the same thing with me in the library, but he developed an idea of public relation, of constitutional relation, with all the rights included in the fundamental rights that are in the Constitution, and that idea of a global and multilateral administrative relationship and constitutional relationship is a way to place our things in constitutional and in public law field. So, I believe there is no need to autonomize the right to water. We can talk about him as a right, but we should integrate it in this broader notion of a right to environment. So there is also a right to the land, a right to the water, and all those fundamental rights are a components of the environmental rights. But in order to speak about the notion of environmental rights, there are also some questions that we have to deal. And I used to say to my students that there are 3 magical questions that we need to answer in order to know if the law, if the right to the water, right to the environment is really a fundamental right, and what does it mean? What is the signification of that? The first question is to know if it makes sense to talk about the right of the environment as a fundamental right, or if we should say that is an objective task, an objective of the public entities disguised in fundamental rights. And that's a question that's also very important in Germany, because lots of professors say it's not really a fundamental right, it's just objective task disguised travestite, I used to say to my students, in order to make some movement to the lecture. It's travestite in fundamental right. The second question we have to answer is if it is really a subjective right, a human subjective right or not. And the third magical question, it is to know what consequences does it bring to our law approach, the answer to the other 2 questions. So it's a kind of a tricky third question that deals with the other 2. So, very briefly, trying to to answer to those questions. The right to water as the right to the environment is indeed, in my view, a fundamental right, not just an objective task disguised of fundamental right. And we can say that by two different views when we are placed in Portugal. First, we can say that by the philosophical point of view, because the fundamental right is something that is connected with the human nature and human dignity. And this human dignity nowadays is not something that was invented by a philosopher in order to create the state. We have already the state. So it's not an invention made by Hobbes, Rousseau, Locke, all the constructors of the state. The idea of a state that is based in human dignity, it's something that is behind all the human rights. And for that we need an historical point of view in order to look at fundamental rights. And that deals with the idea of the generations of fundamental rights, which is something that you know I like very much. Some of our colleagues don't like it. Professor George Miranda is not here, so he would say that's not a good thing. But in my point of view, the idea of generations, Mrs. Katerina also does not like. I hope to convince her. But we'll discuss about it later. The idea of generations gives the idea of a historical point of view from the human rights. And human rights are not just something that has an history, but on the other hand is the history in itself. It's a kind of a Boimlin quotation that the history of our societies is the history of human rights, and they are the history in itself. And this idea of having an historical view of human rights make us tell about the development of human rights. But that development, in my view, is not an increasing of the number of human rights. It's too easy to say that. And from the other hand, that historical view is not the rejection of the idea that rights are to the individuals. There are no rights of states. There are no rights of the community in general. There are no rights of the social society whatsoever. Because in that field, there is an objective protection, but we should not make it, we should distinguish between an individual protection and a collective protection. If we are talking about an individual protection, we are talking about human rights. If we are talking about collective protection, we are no longer talking about human rights, even we are talking about law. The law protects the society, the law protects the peoples. There is a paper of John Rawls about the rights of the peoples contesting the idea, and I agree with him, there's no rights to the peoples. That is an objective way of placing the situation, and we should distinguish between objective protection and individual protection. And we should not mix the things. As Henke say, one thing is my right that belongs to me, and the other thing is the law that goes through my right, and they are different. So there is an objective protection of the community, of the peoples, from the objective point of view, and at the same time, there is a protection of a relation of the citizen between the public entities, the public bodies, and that's the individual, the fundamental right. So, in my view, from the theoretical point of view, the right to the environment is really a fundamental right. But it is also a fundamental right if you look at our Constitution. Our Constitution has an article, the Article 66, that gives a right to the environment as a fundamental right. But the second question is to know if it is still a subjective right. And in my view, it is also a subjective right. The great objection against this idea is to ask if can the environment give an individual right to a citizen being at the same time a collective good. And from my point of view, that's the right way to put it in order to distinguish the collective right as itself and the collective protection of the environment as an objective right of the public entities, and on the other hand, the individual right of using the environment on his own benefit and being able to react against an aggression in the field that is protected by constitutional law. So we have, again, to distinguish the two points of view, the objective point of view and the subjective point of view. The objective point of view protects by law the environment as a collective good, as something that is taken by the law as a principle, as something that gives tasks to the public entities, but we don't need to misunderstand this protection in an objective way with the protection to a relationship between a citizen and a public entity, and that's the individual point of view. So we need to consider at the same time, but we need to differentiate the two protections, the objective and the subjective. Both are important, both are really decisive from our law point of view, but we should not mix them. They should be distinguished. And from that point of view, that distinction between my rights and the law, the distinction between protection of the environment and an individual right of the environment should be distinguished, and that allow us to consider a subjective individual relationship to the environment that is something that is specific of any individual. So, in that point of view, the right to the environment as the right to the water protects the individual at the constitutional point of view against any aggression coming from the public entities and even from privates. And that's their way of being, that's his way of being a fundamental right. But at the same time, that fundamental rights means also the need of an objective protection, not as a right, but as a collective task of the community, and these two perspectives should not be mixed in a unique way of viewing it. So in my point of view, we gain from the theoretical point of view and from the law point of view in distinguish these two situations. And if you look at the right of water, that human rights or that fundamental rights means not just a situation of aggression-free zone, let us say, no aggression prohibited from public entities and from private bodies, but it can also have a positive view. And that positive view is the way that there is a right of each citizen of a proper treatment of the water. And that's very important if you don't think about Europe. If you think about Brazil, if you think about Africa, if you think about other countries. The right to water is not just a negative defensive right, it must be also a positive right, implying that there is an even treatment of the water, there is a duty of the public entities, and that is not just something that is objective, but is also something that is included in the notion of human right. So every citizen can go to a court in order to ask for that treatment that is not placed in that region and in that area. And the third question that is more local question, is more a Portuguese question, is to know how should we place this right to the environment. Because in our Constitution, there is a political distinction. In my view, it's more a political than a constitutional one, a political decision between the rights of the first generation and the ones of the second and the third generation. So the question in Portugal, if it is a DLG, that has a special treatment, or a DSCC, that has a special right with a different regime, legal regime. From my point of view, that distinction is not a law distinction, and we should not apply it to the field of human rights. Not in the way that we say that we have two different law rules that are applied to certain category of rights. That's not the point. Those rules are applied to each right on its subjective point of view and its objective point of view. So the rules from DLG are applied to all rights in their subjective way, from their way of protection against aggressions. And it means that it applies to freedom of expression, to right to work, and to right to the environment. Anyone that is aggressive in the field protected by the Constitution has the right to go immediately to a court in order to ask for a protection of his human right. But at the same time, there are other tasks that are not mandatory, that depend on situations, that depend on economy, that depend on the state of the society, but those are objective, they are not subjective. Those are the ones to whom we can apply the rule of DSCC, the rules that do not protect so much our right from the point of view of constitutional. So, in that point of view, and even if I am almost alone in Portugal defending this idea, I think that we should not distinguish two different law regimes, two different law rules for special category of rights. But on the other hand, we should say that these two kinds of law rules should be applied to all the rights, and all are the same from the law point of view. Because, and I finish with that, in my point of view, if you look at it if you look at that not in a political way, but if you look at it from the point of view of the rights, every human right has a two times double situation. From one right, every human right has a negative way of being conceived, and that means free aggression zone, right of defense. And all the rights, it doesn't matter if it is a fundamental, if it is of the first, the second, or the third generation. It is environmental law, freedom of expression, has the same position and is protected as a right of defense. But there is also a positive point of view. And from that point of view, we can say that the state has not the same obligations as for the first. But I have here a quarrel with my German friends of constitutional law theory, because on my point of view, those rights of action of public authorities that are really mandatory are also a component of the human rights and not just an objective task of the public body. So we have to distinguish between what is mandatory and what is not. If it's not mandatory, it is something that is objective. It is mandatory. It's also something that should be included in the field of human rights. Well, I must say that I wrote something in German for our German colleagues defending it. I hope it will be published and anyone read it. But that's my misunderstanding at the beginning of discussion, an old discussion that I'm having with Hartmut Bauer from a long time ago, and I want to make it also in the German field. It's something collective organized by DETWEF and the Institute for Public Administration. They are preparing a human rights edition in the European field and trying to bring this discussion. So, coming to the point, from my point of view, there is a subjective individual protection in everything that is concerned with the non-aggression zone, but there is also an individual right when there is a mandatory need of action of a public entity. When it's not mandatory, that is not human rights. That is also, but it doesn't mean that it's not protected. It's protected but in an objective way, so it's not possible for the citizen to go to a court and demand it, but the state is still obliged to fulfill that obligation in order to fulfill the human rights. So that was some of the conclusions I wanted to bring to you, more theoretical, but I think they were important in order to place the matter. The right to water is nowadays a very important fundamental right that is stated in most international declarations and with a great importance for human, for protection of the environment. And from my point of view, that right of the water is a component of the right to the environment. It has a negative dimension. It's a protection against any aggression, but it has also a positive dimension, and it means the need to protect actively the quality of water. And that is also a component of that human right. And I give now the floor to Mrs. Catarina Albuquerque to, I don't know, is this supposed to have a break or I don't know. You are the organizer. Well, perhaps you can, do you want to have a break? Oh, yes, I think so. So, Mrs. Catarina Albuquerque, it's a pleasure to hear you. A more interesting session, a more interesting lecture than mine because it has images, so it is more now more up to the time, updated, and it's a pleasure and an honor to hear.
Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I hadn't been here in this faculty for, I will not tell you how long. I studied here in the past century. And I'm very pleased. O que é que a gente tinha que fazer? Abrir. Que a rua não abrir? Então tá bom. I am very... É aqui não? Esta coisinha é um bocado estranha. Ah, é aqui que se carrega, não?
Isso é que eu já não sei.
Espera aí. O engenheiro Mel Batista é que me diz para fazer PowerPoint. Good. So I'm very happy to talk today about an issue that is very dear to me, which is the elimination of inequalities when it comes to water and sanitation. But I decided to give 2 steps backwards and also talk a little bit about what the human right to water and sanitation is. Good. So, at the level of the United Nations, the human right to water was not defined as a component from the right to environment. It was rather defined as a component of the right to an adequate standard of living. I'm not saying that there are no relations between the right to water and the right to the environment. There are, but the right to the environment has not been yet recognized as a human right at the international, at the universal level by the UN. Maybe, and hence the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of the UN, which is a body of independent experts that verifies and monitors the compliance by states parties with the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, this body said that the right to water is an implicit component of the right to an adequate standard of living. This right to an adequate standard of living is consecrated in Article 11 of the Social Rights Covenant, and this article refers that everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living. That includes, and then the article enumerates certain rights that are considered to be part of the right to an adequate standard of living. This language of the Social Rights Covenant was copied from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. And neither the Universal Declaration nor the Covenant refer explicitly to water. But what the committee said was that the enumeration of components of the right to an adequate standard of living was not exhaustive. And the committee then said that it is impossible to enjoy the right to an adequate standard of living without water, which seems obvious to all of us. We can ask ourselves, why wasn't water explicitly consecrated and explicitly referred to neither in the Universal Declaration nor in the Covenant? We know that the world was very different in 1948, that we had colonialism, and many of the countries, for example, that suffer nowadays from the biggest challenges in terms of access to quality water, in terms of availability of water, were simply not directly represented in the negotiations of the Declaration and of the Covenant. And of course, the access that NGOs had to the UN in 1948 was a bit different from the access that NGOs have nowadays, meaning that nowadays when negotiations take place at the UN, you have people from the field coming and influencing policy making and discussions at the UN level, which did not happen, at least not to this extent, in 1948. In 1948 there were women's rights organizations basically participating in the negotiations, and not many more. Good. The committee, I want to deal with this part a little faster, because you have in these leaflets the definition of the rights to water and sanitation. So the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights defined the right to water as the right of everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible and affordable water for personal and domestic uses. That's the definition that was given on the right to water by the committee. Now you might ask, but if the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights decided to elaborate a general comment is an authentic interpretation of the provision of the treaty by the body that is competent to monitor the realization of the implementation of the said treaty. Why didn't the committee also deal with sanitation? Which is, I think, it's an interesting question. I don't know what the official answer is, but I asked members of the committee why it happened. Because when I was appointed, my mandate was and is not only on water, but also on sanitation. And I asked some committee members, Iberril, for example, why didn't you, because he was the leader of the General Comment 15 on the right to water, why didn't you also include sanitation? And it's because of the taboo surrounding sanitation. And I'm pleased to say this word in this faculty I studied, nobody wants to talk about shit. That's the truth. And and it's a taboo issue, and there was some hesitance from the committee members to deal with this stinky issue and mix it with water, which is a much sexier subject. So basically, and the committee members were also aware that bringing sanitation on board to the General Comment would make the negotiations and the approval of the General Comment on water impossible by the date they wanted it to approve, so they left out sanitation. Okay. Then I was appointed in 2008, and my big plan in 2008 was to make sure that the rights to water and sanitation got recognized by the end of the first term of my mandate, 2011. So what did I say? I have to write reports to the UN on the issues that are more more sensitive, and and issues that have been less developed by the UN committees, but also by the legal doctrine. So my first report was precisely on sanitation. And in that report, I asserted that there are clear human rights obligations related to access to sanitation. That simply saying that there are that sanitation has so many links with so many human rights that it does not deserve recognition, in my opinion, was not right, because there are other dimensions of sanitation that are not captured when you simply relate it to human rights as the right to health, or the right to water, or the right to an environment, or whatever. My idea, and what I said then, was that it deserves an autonomous recognition. Then I pointed to the fact that there were several precedents for considering sanitation as a component of the right to an adequate standard of living, the same way that water had been considered as a component. And then I also said that there was support to the trend towards recognition as a distinctive right, and I said that I supported this trend. So what happened? In 2010, I received a phone call from the ambassador of Bolivia in New York, telling me that he was preparing a draft resolution on the right to water. And this made me very nervous, because I didn't want water to be recognized alone. And I took a plane to New York to talk with the ambassador, and I convinced him to include sanitation. So I would call him from Lisbon every week, asking him, have you deleted sanitation? Have you deleted sanitation? You promised you would not delete sanitation. And he did not delete sanitation, even though many UN member states, including the United Kingdom, were threatening to call for a vote if sanitation stayed in the text. It stayed in the text. They did not call for the vote because the US called for a vote, so they didn't need to. So in 2010, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution explicitly recognizing the right to water and sanitation. What I say, my position is that this right existed before, because it was already an implicit component of the right to an adequate standard of living, consecrated both in the Universal Declaration and in the Covenant. But now it's clear. There is an explicit recognition. Of course, as I told you, the US called for a vote in 2010. Nobody voted against the resolution. There were 40-something abstentions. Setembro. 2 months later, in September, the UN Human Rights Council passed another resolution by consensus, restating what the General Assembly had said, and saying that it is the right to water and sanitation is a component of the right to an adequate standard of living. Last year, in November, the General Assembly passed again another resolution on the right to water and sanitation, and the good thing about this resolution is that nobody called for a vote. It was consensually adopted by the UN General Assembly. Another important thing that happened last year was that the Human Rights Council, in its September resolution on the rights to water and sanitation, went a step further, because before it had only said there is a right to water and sanitation. But now it said what these rights mean. And it said that these rights mean that water and sanitation have to be available, they have to be of quality, they have to be culturally, socially acceptable. If you have questions, you can ask me, I will not enter into details. They have to be accessible, and they have to be financially also accessible, not only physically accessible, but financially, meaning affordable. And they have to be realized for all without discrimination. And I think this was a very important step in making these rights much more concrete, and the obligations that states have much more explicit. Good. Voila, this is what I said. What do I want also to say? That all human rights, as you were saying, Professor Vasco Pereira da Silva, all human rights entail 3 types of obligations. Independently of the fact that we label them as civil and political rights or economic and social and cultural rights. We don't care. That's why I don't like the generation of rights. But we can talk later about it. find a common ground. Good. So, every human right entails an obligations by the state to respect the right, which is the negative component, no? To respect, to protect, and to fulfill. So it's this tripartite obligation that applies to any human right, meaning there are obligations of abstention to a large degree, but then in certain circumstances the state has to step in order to protect the right from the interference of third parties, or well, even to fulfill the right. I was 2 weeks ago in Jordan visiting refugee camps of Syrian refugees, and there is an obligation upon the government of Jordan to fulfill the right to water and also to sanitation to these people who, for reasons beyond their control, cannot accede to these rights. So there is an obligation of the state to step in and to fulfill the rights in certain circumstances or for certain groups of the population who, again, for reasons beyond their control, cannot exercise the right. Okay. The rights to water and, economic, social and cultural rights are that's what the covenant says, of progressive realization, meaning that the state has to take steps to ensure that the rights become a reality for all over time. This should not be an excuse for inaction, on the one hand, and there are components of the right that are of immediate realization. Like, for example, the principle of non-discrimination, it's of immediate realization. Then there are other components that you can say, okay, are of progressive realization. Like, for example, moving up in the levels of service. What human rights say is that you have to first ensure a basic level for everyone, that ensures, of course, quality, accessibility, availability, etc. But then it's then progressively that you will move up the water ladder or the sanitation ladder, and that part is of progressive realization. Then, the rights to water and sanitation, like any other human right, also, how shall I say it? Not benefit. Their definition is not only composed by the elements that I mentioned before, but they also have to be implemented according to these cross-cutting principles. The principle of non-discrimination and equality, the principle of participation, information, accountability, and sustainability, which goes hand in hand with non-retrogression. Non-retrogression being backward steps in realizing these rights. Good. Quanto tempo é que eu ainda tenho? Não se sabe. Então pronto. 25 minutos. Estou a brincar. Okay. And now I'm going to talk about the principle of non-discrimination and how to include the principle of non-discrimination in the post-2015 development agenda. Okay, so I have two things to say. As you know, the world has started already some years ago to think about how to frame the global development agenda after 2015. You know that in 2000 the world adopted the Millennium Development Goals, and well, these goals are not very human rights friendly, to say the least. And in the water sector, I think that we have been the best sector among the different ones that want to figure in the post-2015 agenda. We started 3 years ago, I think, working on the definition of goal, targets and indicators for water and sanitation. I chaired a group on the elimination of inequalities, which worked on how to integrate this principle, or how to operationalize the principle of non-discrimination in the global development agenda. And of course, my proposals apply to water and sanitation, but they also apply to other development areas and obviously to other human rights. And now the question is, why did I start working on non-discrimination in such a passionate manner? Because in the country missions that I undertake as Special Rapporteur, I came across consistent, persistent situations of discrimination, of lack of access to water and sanitation in all countries that I visited. And this started, and this of course happens in lower income countries, but obviously also in the United States of America, in Slovenia. I was also in Slovenia on a country mission. And also in Japan, just to mention some of the richest countries that I visited as Special Rapporteur. And what was interesting was that when I visited these countries, people were making jokes and saying, why are you going, for example, in the US, why are you going to visit... what was the name of the place? It's a place near where the Kennedys have their summer house, near Boston. Okay. It's you know. Okay. So, como é que ele se chama? É por aí, era perto de Martha's Vineyard. So people were making jokes and saying, why are you going there? It has another name. Cape Cod. Quem é que disse Cape Cod? Acertou. 10 pontos. Cape Cod, pois, é outro. Cape Cod. And people were making jokes saying, oh, you are going to the Cape. And obviously, in the Cape Cod, you have, of course, all these beautiful houses, but you also have a huge amount of migrant workers, many of them from Cape Verde, Portuguese-speaking migrant workers, who live in bad housing, without access always to water and to sanitation. And these are the people who work in the big houses as employees or who work in the supermarkets and in the stores, etc. Good. This is a sanitation solution that was invented by a homeless person I met in California. His name was Tim Buckley, and he lived in a tent city. He was basically homeless, and all the people in his community, they lived near a park in Sacramento, and they lived in this kind of tents. And the city of Sacramento, as many cities in America, criminalize open defecation and open urination. In some states, it's even considered as a sexual offense. And the idea of the authorities is, if we criminalize these practices, and in parallel, if we shut down public restrooms, this means that we get rid of the homeless. Of course, that's not what happens. So Tim went to a supermarket, bought that tent, and built this kind of toilet. He built it on a chair, made a hole, put the slab, and this means that every day, you see this bike, you see these white bags, he puts 2 plastic bags below the slab, and every day he closes the bags, which are full of human waste, and he puts them in the bike, and he goes to the city center, because all the restrooms were shut down, where he finds one open toilet. He opens the bag, he dumps the content into the toilet, and he flushes the toilet, and then he says he puts the 2 bags in the 3rd bag, he disposes of the 3rd bag, and he sanitizes his hands with water and lemon. And when I visited the US, in my press conference, I said that this was equivalent to inhuman and degrading treatment, which is something that the US government didn't like. This is Slovenia, and this is a Roma man belonging to the Roma ethnic group. And this man lives for 20 years in an informal settlement in the country, and he was telling me that because they don't have access to water, and they are the only people in Slovenia without access to water, from what I know. He said his daughter once came home and she was crying. And he asked her, why are you crying? And she said, because the other kids are teasing me because I stink. And the father was saying, I know that she stinks because we don't have water at home, so we cannot bath. There is a river nearby where they can bath in the summer. The police harasses them and doesn't let them bath. That's one part of the story. But then in winter, in spring, or in autumn when it's cold, they cannot go to the river to bath. So this means that the daughter stopped going to school, and this also means that this family stopped receiving the minimum guaranteed income because it was connected to the fact that the kids would attend school. And this is the only group in Slovenia that does not have access to water and sanitation. In the US, well, it's the homeless people. I also met other people, like migrant workers, also in California, migrant workers in the area of Boston, who else? Well, other groups. Just to highlight the issues of non-discrimination. This is, I will not enter into details, this is a slum in Cairo. And when the authorities told me that everyone had access to water and it was water, like 98% or 99% of the population, I asked, but this does not match with what I've seen, because I visited slum A, B, and C, and D, where there live I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people, and they don't have access. And then the answer by the government was very simple. They simply said, oh, but they are illegal, they don't count. So they don't even enter into the statistics. Problem solved. This is Bangladesh. This is a Dalit community. The Dalits, as you know, are the lower caste. Even though Bangladesh is a Muslim country, they imported the caste system from India. And if you see the photo on the left, you might understand this is a toilet in the place they live. So you can imagine how these toilets stank. And basically what you see on the walls and on the floor is human waste, full stop. And this woman, well, it's the only, they have 2 water taps in the camp, in the community for over 1,000 people. And these taps are the ones they use for their personal hygiene, but also to wash their clothes, to wash the dishes, as you see here. This is a tribe in the north of Namibia, near Angola. Epupa, it's Angola, it's near Angola. I forgot the name of the tribe, never mind, I will remind it later, which I visited, and well, this is, and it was not for the photo, they were drinking the water that they took from a hole in the ground, and that's the quality of the water they drank in Namibia. Oh, I don't want to show you this one yet. Okay. Good. So basically, what do we know? We know that even though the world is making progress, don't look at the screen, even though we know that the world is making progress in terms of access to water and sanitation, and for example in terms of water, the world has met the Millennium Development Goal target already in 2010, 5 years before the deadline, which is, we can say, good news. The problem is that what we are witnessing is that inequalities persist, or inequalities even deepen within societies. So what does it mean? Because of the way in which the Millennium Development Goals were framed, there was no incentive for states to reach the hardest to reach. So what did governments do? They wanted to show results, so they invested and they targeted the low-hanging fruits, those who were easier to reach. And that's how the numbers were met. The targets were met. Of course, we have also to say that the target was met because, to a great extent, because simply of China and India, because of the progress made in China and India. And so what I've seen regarding the MDGs was that governments, when I talked with governments, they were more concerned about the overall progress, about the big numbers, rather than looking at the specific problems. And in richer countries like the US or Japan or Slovenia, what I saw was a disregard to these situations that only affect, we know, a small proportion of the population, 1%, 2%, I don't know. I was now on mission in Brazil, I saw the same. But of course, each one of these people has a human right to water and sanitation. And what human rights say is that you have to first ensure basic access to everyone before you move up the ladder. So what did we come up with? I built a working group of experts from different places of the world, and we worked on this issue with the support of UN University, New York University, and we came up with this idea, which looks very simple, but which means the following, that any future goal, any future target has to go hand in hand with an obligation to progressively eliminate inequalities. So you will only consider the goal or the target as met if it is met for the different minority groups or vulnerable groups in the country. You see what I'm trying to say? So what does it mean? It means that the government will be obliged first to identify vulnerable groups in the country, number one, or groups that are disadvantaged. It can look at the rural versus urban divide. It can look at formal versus informal settlements. It can look at the overall population and ethnic minorities. It can look at the overall population and persons with disabilities, etc., etc., etc. Sky is the limit. And then the government has to disaggregate the data to understand, okay, this example that I have here on the screen relates to sanitation. So you have in a given country, it's a developing country, you look at the advantaged group of the population, for example, the upper wealth quintile, the richest in the country, the upper fifth, has 60% access to sanitation. And then you look at the poorest people and they have 17% of access. So you already identify a gap. And the obligation until the end date of the future development goals is to eliminate progressively the disparities between the advantaged and the disadvantaged groups. And this means precisely what human rights say, that you have to invest more, you have to make a bigger effort to lift up the disadvantaged group. You have to make less efforts in the advantaged group. And this is, of course, it is not easy to make, to do, because you will need to have data, you will need to disaggregate data, you also have to have the political courage at the national level to accept, to admit that there are these inequalities inside your country, which many countries are not willing to do. But this is something that is on the table, that has been taken up by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She's now making this proposal not only for water and sanitation, but for all goals, that we incorporate the progressive elimination of inequalities. The Deputy Secretary General of the UN, I organized a side event at the UN with him, and he also supports this proposal. And the Open Working Group of the UN, who is working on the Sustainable Development Goals, has also devoted a full day of discussion, 2 days of discussion, to the issue of the elimination of inequalities, and it identified inequalities as one of the big issues for the post-2015 agenda. And when I say inequalities, this is my last sentence, I'm not only talking about wealth inequalities, income inequalities, which are important, but also at other types of inequalities that are based on other factors, like the ones I mentioned before. I would be very happy to answer 2 questions if you have any, and this is all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It was a very impressive presentation, and we learned a lot from you.